Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to offer a theory about the recent short track called The Trouble with Edward. And there's a small detail that most people probably missed when they watched it, and so I'm going to use that little detail to try to come up with a theory that will also explain a lot of the continuity issues created by this short track, and I discussed that in detail in my previous videos. You can check them out. And I don't think that's something the writers thought about, and I think that Black Badge was probably just there by accident, but I'm still going to use it as part of my theory to explain all the problems. So as you see in the snapshot, Edward was actually wearing a black badge in one of those scenes in that short track. It looks like the same kind of badge that was used by Section 31 members in Season 2 of Star Trek Discovery, in which Section 31 didn't appear to be very clandestine because all the admirals and many of the captains and commanders knew all about it apparently, and members of Section 31 were walking freely in front of everybody on the ship with their special uniforms and their black badges. And so apparently it was like common knowledge in all of Starfleet that there's a section called the 31 that are involved in clandestine operations, but by the end of Season 2 it was implied that Section 31 will be dismantled or changed somehow. It was actually said they will be more transparent, which doesn't really make sense. I think judging by the other shows that this is a prequel to, Section 31 should become a totally unknown organization by anyone. That is only like a rumor that some people say it might still exist because it used to exist in the past. It was said to be totally independent organization that is basically a rogue organization, and that Starfleet considers it illegal, but it remains ambiguous as how much Starfleet actually works with it. Maybe some admirals actually collude with it. That was actually implied in Deep Space Nine. Admiral Ross was in collusion with them and so on. But it may have been only because of the war that was so desperate in that time period. Maybe that's the only reason, and under normal circumstances no one in Starfleet would work with them. So it was all kind of very ambiguous, but in Discovery apparently Section 31 was a very big part of humanity's operation in space. Apparently they had at least 30 ships with advanced secret technology that they didn't give to the rest of Starfleet. For whatever reason they wanted to keep their edge, I guess. And in Deep Space Nine it was said that Section 31 was doing all kinds of illegal things, like infecting people with viruses that would exterminate them, basically committing genocide and committing false flag attacks and stuff like that, framing people for things they didn't do because it serves their interest. So keeping all of that in mind, we can assume that Section 31 kept operating even after the events of Star Trek Discovery. Maybe it was the point in which they kind of broke off and became a secret, totally secret organization. Or maybe Starfleet itself decided to keep them more secret and not to talk about them openly ever, and so no lower ranking officer would even know they exist, that they still exist. And we know that this short track, The Trouble with Edward, is taking place after the end of Season 2 in Discovery, because in the final episode of Discovery, the stardate was 1201, and in this short track, the stardate is 1421. And so this is taking place after the end of Season 2 of Discovery, after Section 31 is supposedly gone, but it's possible it still operates in secret. Maybe some of its former members were put into Starfleet instead, so possibly some of the people in Starfleet were former Section 31 operatives. So because we see Edward wearing a black badge in one of the scenes, it's possible he used to be a member of them and still kept that badge and that uniform. Maybe he secretly works for some members of Section 31 who still operate. Maybe all of this can explain how he even got into Starfleet, because judging by his personality that we saw, he doesn't really share the ideals of Starfleet. He wants to use the Tribbles as food, he wants to genetically modify them, he even suggested giving them brain damage so that they wouldn't be intelligent, so there would be no moral problems with eating them. So that definitely wasn't in the spirit of Starfleet, and so the question arises, how did he even get into Starfleet? So my explanation is that maybe he didn't, maybe he was a member of Section 31, maybe because he was such a brilliant scientist with no moral problems, maybe that's why 31 wanted him. But after it was disbanded, maybe that's when he became a part of Starfleet instead. And maybe they know about it, maybe that's why he's not ashamed of that black badge, that's why he wore it in that scene while he was working on those Tribbles. So maybe he went nuts after whatever happened with 31, maybe he lost all his friends there, maybe that's why he became kind of weird. Maybe he was always weird and 31 just wanted him for his scientific knowledge and for the fact that he had no problem with morality issues, and after that he became part of Starfleet and they were all uncomfortable with him. Or maybe he was still working for 31 secretly while pretending to be a Starfleet officer, and maybe his strange behavior is just an act, maybe it's all part of the plan to make it all look like an accident. Maybe he wasn't really as stupid and as strange as he pretended to be in this short trek, and maybe he didn't even die in the end. It's very possible he was beamed out by some other ship that is using some kind of stealth technology like the 31 ships. Maybe he just pretended to die, and maybe he pretended to be stupid in that whole event in order to take the blame on himself so that Starfleet itself will be held blameless. Maybe that was part of the plan. That's how 31 was always doing things. They tried to do things without anyone knowing who did them, or if anyone does find out, they try to take responsibility for themselves instead of the blame being on all of Starfleet or all the Federation. So that was, I think, part of the reason they sometimes were in the open, wearing their black uniforms and being open about being 31, maybe to attract all the attention, all the blame for themselves as a rogue organization, which maybe wasn't really rogue, we don't really know. Maybe it only pretended to be a rogue organization so that whatever they did wouldn't be blamed on Starfleet or on the Federation, and 31 will take all the blame. So maybe that's why they sometimes use that designation, and calling themselves that to other people. That was only done because they wanted it known that it was 31 who did all of that and not Starfleet itself. Probably most times they tried to be completely in the shadows, meaning they did things without anyone ever knowing that they are the ones who did them. But whenever it was necessary, sometimes they took the blame on themselves as a rogue group to try to keep the rest of the Federation and Starfleet clean about whatever happened. And so this might be one of those kinds of situations in which they knew they couldn't really keep it a secret. They actually wanted to create those fast reproducing tribbles in order to use them against the Klingons, who 31 probably still considered a big threat. So it's very possible that 31 actually wanted to create those fast reproducing tribbles to use them as a weapon against the Klingons, because the Klingons were still a very big threat to the Federation in this time period, and 31 knew that, and so maybe they wanted to weaken the Klingon Empire, and one of the ways to do that without causing a major war was to basically sabotage their food supplies. Maybe they had a lot of farming planets on which they were growing all their organic food, because we know that the Klingons love to eat real meat, they want to eat living animals and not replicated ones. Maybe they don't even have replicator technology yet, and so they are highly dependent on their planets on which they grow their animals, and those animals probably eat vegetables. So if you infect all those farming planets with tribbles, then the Klingons will basically lose a lot of their food supplies, and it will damage their economy and all of that. They would have to buy it from other planets maybe, and so you would basically weaken the Klingon Empire. So it's possible it was all a ploy by Section 31. Maybe they knew that Tribbles had the genetic potential that if augmented would be a real menace to the Klingon food supply, but they had to do it in a way that would either remain secret, or if discovered, Starfleet will be held blameless. If discovered, they wanted to be able to blame it on someone, on an individual, instead of the blame being on all of Starfleet or all the Federation. And so it's possible that they had this Edward guy pretend to be a weird, strange, idiot guy, in order to take all the blame for himself, so that Starfleet won't be blamed as an organization. And this way, even if this whole event gets discovered by the Klingons, they will be able to tell the Klingons this is all the fault of that one guy who died, and therefore don't blame us, we apologize, we're not to blame, and so on. So it's possible this is all part of that clever ploy, and also this whole event could have been classified by Starfleet, maybe to avoid a potential war with the Klingons over this issue, because maybe the Klingons will hate the Tribbles so much because of what happened next, that Starfleet doesn't want to admit that they were actually the ones responsible, and so maybe they classified that whole event. Maybe that's why McCoy and Kirk never knew about the Tribbles when they encountered them a few years later. Maybe that whole event was classified, and maybe Edward was actually an agent of 31 who was deliberately behaving like an idiot, so that at least internally everybody in Starfleet will think that this was all just an embarrassing incident, which was probably better received by other officers compared to the idea that Starfleet deliberately is engaged in those kinds of immoral and illegal activities. And so that was basically an excuse to blame it on someone stupid who was acting against orders, who violated his orders, and who died, and therefore cannot testify about all of this. He apparently died. I'm saying he could have easily been beamed out from that pile of Tribbles by another ship in the vicinity, maybe a disguised 31 ships. We do know they have those holographic stealth technology. They can look like something else in space, and they could beam him out of there. and then maybe change his face and change his identity, so we'll never know that he was still alive. And maybe that whole strange behavior was simply part of an act, and this way, even if this whole event ever gets declassified, if it's ever discovered that those genetically augmented Tribbles were actually the fault of Starfleet, they would simply be able to point the finger at that strange idiot guy and say it was all his fault, and not all of us as an organization or as a species, we humans are still enlightened, we're not the ones who did that to you, it was all that idiot guy who died, so don't hold it against us, basically. So it could have all been part of that clever scheme that was deliberately done, but done in a way to blame it all on one idiot guy, and then also classifying the whole event on top of it. So basically layer upon layer of deception. So I think this is an interesting theory that could fix some of the continuity problems with this whole thing. And this whole idea of augmenting the Tribbles to use them as a weapon against the Klingons, I remember I suggested that back when Discovery first started, from the very beginning when we saw Captain Lorca, it was immediately obvious he's kind of shady, that he's doing all kinds of secret, nasty things. And then we saw he has a Tribble on his desk, and so I remember I suggested back then that maybe he will genetically augment the Tribble to use them as a weapon against the Klingons, and that could be an interesting backstory about how they came to be. And I also suggested maybe the whole ship should be revealed later to be a Section 31 project, and that will explain why it was all classified, why no one else ever knew about it later. And I don't think the writers thought about that yet, because it didn't end up being a 31 project, it ended up just being a normal Starfleet ship, but they did introduce Section 31 in Season 2 of Star Trek Discovery, and so it's possible they took some of these ideas from the fans. A lot of fans were talking about that, not just me. A lot of fans were saying that, that whole spirit of Star Trek Discovery feels kind of shady, kind of immoral, kind of nasty. Maybe it's all will be revealed to be set in a mirror universe, or maybe it's all a Section 31 ship. And the mirror universe theory kind of came true partly because Captain Lorca was revealed to be from the mirror universe, which kind of explains why he was so shady and evil and all of that. The 31 theory didn't really come true, but maybe the writers heard about all of that from the fans, and that's why they included 31 in Season 2, which I don't think they did that well. It was just there basically to be there, just to sound cool, because they knew the fans wanted that, but they didn't really do anything that clever with it. And I remember I suggested one of my ideas from the moment I saw the Tribble with Lorca. I said maybe Lorca will genetically augment the Tribble and secretly use it against the Klingons to sabotage their food supply. And there was even an episode about the Klingons starving, they didn't have enough food. So that kind of confirmed that they don't have replicators in this time period, and so they have to have real food. And so a Tribble would be a nice weapon, a secret weapon that you wouldn't have to take responsibility for if you do it secretly, and you can infect their planets with Tribbles to eliminate their food supply as a covered way to weaken their empire. So I do kind of like that idea, and so maybe in this short trek, because we saw Edward with that black badge in one of the scenes, and he's the one who creates these augmented Tribbles who do end up infecting Klingon planets. So maybe all of this was a ploy by Section 31. It would also explain why someone like Edward was even accepted into Starfleet. In Starfleet they always pick the best of the best. They put people through a psych test before they accept them into Starfleet and all of that. And so how did he end up in Starfleet? Unless he wasn't like that before, or he was put there by 31, or it was all an act by him, pretending to be so stupid so that he will take the blame on himself for all what that happened. Maybe he deliberately wanted to provoke the captain to directly give him orders not to do it, and then he did it anyway, and this way Starfleet can say if it ever gets declassified or discovered, they'll simply be able to point to him and say he's the one who is guilty of everything, and we Starfleet were not the ones who did that, we didn't do it deliberately. And this can be used to basically appease the Klingons, but maybe secretly Edward was actually working for 31, and maybe he was even beamed out of there in the last second when he was supposedly buried by those Tribbles. It can also explain why didn't he seem worried, why didn't he try to save his life by running to that shuttle, why did he stay behind with the Tribbles, apparently in kind of a suicide. So maybe he wasn't really stupid, maybe he was simply a secret agent, pretending to be stupid to take all the blame, and he didn't really die, but actually was beamed out by a 31 ship after successfully fulfilling his mission. So I think this theory would explain away a lot of the plot lines, a lot of the illogical things that happened, and a lot of the continuity issues. Why it was all classified, why Kirk and McCoy never knew about the Tribbles later, why it infected the Klingon planets from all places, why the Tribble react so negatively to the Klingons. Maybe that's something also that was genetically engineered into them by Edward or by 31. As for the human DNA in the tribbles, maybe it was disseminated in such a way that would never be detected by anyone else who doesn't know about it. It would not be detectable by anyone else. Maybe it was just fragments of human DNA that was set into specific points of the tribal DNA. Maybe the tribbles later mutated again and some of the DNA was lost. Maybe that's why they were not reproducing as quickly later on, because in TOS era they were still fast reproducing, but not as quickly as they were in this short track. So maybe some of that effect kind of wore down, some of their genetics returned closer to normal later on, and so the human part of their DNA was never detected by the Klingons, and so the Klingons never discovered that it was all a ploy by 31. So anyway, so that's my theory to try to explain everything just for fun. Let me know what you think about it and we can discuss it in the comment section, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.